Alexander the Great and the Siege of Tyre. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great marched to the edge of the Mediterranean and confronted a city that seemed to have defeated geography itself. Tyre did not merely stand beside the sea. Its most important districts stood in the sea, protected by towering walls, experienced sailors, and two heavily defended harbors. To reach it, Alexander would have to do something extraordinary. He would have to build a road across the ocean. Only 24 years old, Alexander had already crushed the Persian army at the Battle of Issus. King Darius III had fled, leaving his family and much of his treasure behind. But Alexander did not immediately pursue him eastward. Instead, he marched south through Phoenicia, along the coast of what is now Lebanon. There was a strategic reason for this. The Persian Empire still possessed a powerful navy, and much of that navy was crewed by Phoenician sailors. If Alexander advanced deep into Asia while hostile ports remained behind him, Persian ships could threaten his supply lines, attack Greece, or transport enemy troops into his rear. The coastal cities of Aradus, Byblos, and Sidon submitted. Tyre did not. Tyre was one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the ancient Mediterranean. Its merchants had sailed across the known world, establishing colonies as far west as North Africa and Spain. Its most famous colony, Carthage, was itself becoming a great Mediterranean power. But Tyre was actually divided between two locations. Old Tyre stood on the mainland. The principal city, however, occupied an island roughly half a mile offshore. Its walls rose directly from the water, and the historian Arrian claimed that the defenses facing the mainland reached approximately 150 feet in height, although modern historians question whether they were truly that tall. Whatever their exact height, the walls were enormous, strongly constructed, and nearly impossible to approach with conventional siege engines. At first, Alexander attempted diplomacy. He announced that he wished to enter Tyre and sacrifice at the ancient temple of Melkart, the chief god of the city. The Greeks identified Melkart with their hero Heracles, or Hercules, from whom Alexander's royal family claimed descent. But the Tyrians understood what Alexander's request really meant. Allowing him, his guards, and his officers through the gates would amount to surrender. They replied that Alexander could make his sacrifice at the older temple on the mainland, but no Persian or Macedonian would be permitted inside the island city. The answer enraged him. Alexander gathered his officers and explained that Tyre could not be ignored. As long as it remained independent, the Persian fleet retained a secure base. Egypt could not be safely invaded, and Alexander could not pursue Darius without leaving a dangerous enemy behind him. According to later accounts, Alexander sent additional representatives to demand submission. The Tyrians killed them and threw their bodies from the walls into the sea. The siege began in January 332 BC. Alexander's army was among the finest fighting forces in the world, but it had one obvious problem. Soldiers could not march across half a mile of seawater. Alexander's solution was breathtakingly simple. He ordered his men to fill in the sea. The ruins of old Tyre were torn apart. Stones, timber, earth, and broken masonry were carried to the shoreline and dumped into the channel. Alexander intended to construct a massive causeway, known as a mole, stretching all the way from the mainland to the island. One ancient writer claimed that Alexander personally carried the first basket of material and cast it into the water. Whether completely accurate or not, the story captures his style of leadership. He frequently appeared among the workers, encouraged them, rewarded exceptional effort, and made it clear that the project would continue regardless of the difficulty. At first, construction moved rapidly. The water near the mainland was shallow, and the muddy bottom helped hold the stones and wooden stakes in place. But farther from shore, the channel became deeper. Near the island, the seabed dropped to approximately 18 feet. Waves battered the unfinished structure, while Tyrian ships sailed around its exposed sides. Archers and artillery crews on the walls showered the laborers with arrows, stones, and burning projectiles. The Macedonians were engineers and soldiers, but while carrying baskets and stones, they were dangerously exposed. Alexander therefore ordered two great wooden towers built at the end of the causeway. Their fronts were covered with hides to resist flaming arrows. Catapults and other missile weapons were placed on the upper platforms, allowing Macedonian crews to fire back at the defenders while workers continued extending the mole. for a time, the plan worked. Then the Tyrians unleashed one of the most spectacular weapons of the ancient world. They took an old horse transport vessel and packed it with dry branches, chaff, pitch, sulfur, torches, and anything else that would burn. Cauldrons filled with flammable substances were suspended from its masts. The stern was weighted so that the bow rose higher in the water. Waiting until the wind blew toward the causeway, Tyrian ships towed the vessel forward. At the last moment, its crew set it ablaze and drove it directly into the end of Alexander's mole. The result was an inferno. Flames engulfed the siege towers. As the masts collapsed, the suspended cauldrons spilled their burning contents across the wooden structures. Tyrian archers fired continuously, preventing Macedonian soldiers from approaching the fire. Small boats then rushed from the city, landing troops along the mole. They tore down protective barriers and burned siege engines that the fire ship had not already destroyed. In a matter of hours, months of Macedonian work appeared to be ruined. Most commanders would have reconsidered the entire operation. Alexander simply ordered the causeway rebuilt, wider, stronger, and capable of supporting even more towers. But he had also learned an important lesson. Tyre could not be conquered while it controlled the sea. Alexander traveled to Sidon and gathered ships from the Phoenician cities that had already surrendered. This was a devastating political reversal for Tyre. The very vessels that had once served in the Persian fleet were now placed under Alexander's command. Approximately 80 Phoenician ships joined him. Rhodes and several other territories contributed additional vessels. Then the kings of Cyprus arrived with about 120 ships. Altogether, Alexander assembled a fleet of roughly 220 warships. When this armada appeared off Tyre, the defenders were stunned. They had expected Alexander to remain a land-based commander struggling against an island. Instead, he had transformed himself into the master of the surrounding sea. The Tyrians withdrew their ships into their two harbors and blocked the entrances. Alexander stationed Cypriot vessels opposite the northern or Sidonian harbor, while his Phoenician ships watched the southern or Egyptian harbor. Tyre was now surrounded. Still, the city did not surrender. The Tyrians dumped enormous stones into the water beneath their walls, preventing Alexander's ships from approaching closely enough to use battering rams. Macedonian crews attempted to drag the stones away with ropes and hoist them with cranes. Tyrian boats responded by cutting the ship's anchor cables. When Alexander protected the ropes with armored vessels, Tyrian divers slipped beneath the surface and continued cutting them underwater. Alexander replaced the ropes with iron chains. The divers could no longer sever them. The Tyrians reportedly heated sand until it was red hot and poured it over the walls. The burning grains found their way beneath shields and armor, scorching skin and forcing soldiers to tear away their protection while exposed to arrows. Both sides adapted repeatedly. Every Macedonian innovation produced a Tyrian countermeasure, and every Tyrian countermeasure forced Alexander's engineers to devise something new. The defenders then attempted a surprise naval attack. They concealed activity inside the northern harbor by hanging sails across its entrance. Alexander normally withdrew to his tent during the hottest part of the afternoon, and the Tyrians had studied his routine carefully. At midday, 13 of their best warships quietly slipped from the harbor in single file. They approached the Cypriot blockade without the usual shouted rhythm of oarsmen. Then, at close range, they charged. Several Cypriot vessels were sunk or driven ashore before their crews could properly react. But on that particular day, Alexander returned earlier than expected. He immediately boarded a warship, gathered several available vessels, and raced around the island. Other ships sealed the harbor entrance, preventing additional Tyrian vessels from emerging. The attackers suddenly found themselves trapped outside. Some escaped back into the harbor, but others were damaged or captured. The Tyrians had demonstrated their naval skill, yet the attack cost them some of their best ships and ended their ability to seriously challenge Alexander at sea. The Macedonians could now bring floating battering rams directly against the walls. Repeated blows finally weakened a section of the southern defenses. Alexander attempted an immediate assault across a boarding bridge, but the Tyrians drove his men back. He waited 3 days for calm water and prepared a much larger coordinated attack. On the chosen day, ships carrying archers and artillery surrounded the island, firing from multiple directions. Other vessels attacked the entrances to both harbors, battering rams widened the breach in the southern wall. Two ships carrying boarding bridges moved forward, loaded with Alexander's elite infantry. Alexander was aboard one of them. As the bridges crashed against the broken wall, Admetus, commander of the elite shield-bearing guards, became the first Macedonian officer to reach the battlements. He was almost immediately struck by a spear and killed. Alexander followed him onto the wall. Once the Macedonians gained firm footing, they pushed the defenders back, seized adjoining towers, and moved along the battlements. At nearly the same moment, Alexander's Phoenician allies broke into the southern harbor, while the Cypriot fleet penetrated the northern harbor. The attack came from the breached wall, the sea, and both harbors simultaneously. Tyre's defenses collapsed. The remaining Tyrian soldiers gathered near the sanctuary of Agenor and made a final stand, but they were overwhelmed. After 7 months of labor, fire, naval fighting, and repeated assaults, Alexander's men entered the city enraged and exhausted. They had also witnessed captured Macedonians being killed on the walls and their bodies thrown into the sea. What followed was brutal. Ancient accounts disagree on the precise numbers. Arrian reported that approximately 8,000 Tyrians were killed and about 30,000 captives were sold into slavery. Another ancient historian, Quintus Curtius Rufus, wrote that roughly 6,000 defenders were killed during the capture, and that 2,000 prisoners were later crucified along the shoreline. Arrian placed total Macedonian deaths during the siege at about 400. Such ancient casualty figures cannot be independently verified, but all surviving accounts agree that the fall of Tyre was followed by mass killing, enslavement, and severe punishment. Tyre's king, Azamilchus, and others who had taken refuge inside the temple of Melkart were spared. Then, after destroying the city's independence and killing or enslaving much of its population, Alexander finally performed the sacrifice he had originally requested. His army marched in a ceremonial procession. Ships participated in the celebration, athletic contests were held, and the battering ram that had broken the wall was dedicated in the temple. The message was unmistakable. The ceremony Tyre had refused would now be conducted by its conqueror. The siege of Tyre demonstrated much of what made Alexander so formidable. He was not simply a battlefield commander. He could adapt his entire method of warfare, recruit the fleets of former enemies, coordinate land and naval forces, solve engineering problems, and continue after catastrophic setbacks. But it also revealed the darker side of his ambition. His persistence could become obsession, and resistance was sometimes answered with terrifying vengeance. The causeway itself may have been Alexander's most permanent victory. Modern geological research indicates that his engineers built across a naturally forming underwater sandbank. The completed structure changed local currents and encouraged centuries of additional sediment to accumulate around it. Today, the island Alexander struggled for 7 months to reach is no longer an island. Tyre is joined to the mainland by a broad peninsula, the distant consequence of the day Alexander the Great ordered his soldiers to build a road through the sea.